welcome to Interface. Today we have as our guest Professor MGS Narayanan, formerly Chairman of ICHR, and he is currently the President of Kerala History Conference. Welcome, sir. The studies on Indian history are taking place from the colonial period onwards. What do you think about the historical studies on India?
In our traditional system, before the establishment of the British authority, history was not included in the general curriculum. They used to teach, for example, Kavya, that is poetry, Vyakarana, that is grammar, Tarka, that is logic, but Charitra or Itihasa was never part of the general scheme of education. With the introduction of the British authority in India and their conquest of India almost completely, the whole territory, after that one important thing, an achievement of theirs, was to devise a common system of education, a common language, English language. Now, of course, we used to condemn it as the imposition of the British people, the English language, a foreign language, but nowadays it has become an Indian language itself. For example, much of our freedom struggle was conducted by our leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, all these everybody, whichever party they were, whichever part of India, their writings and speeches were mostly done in English, because that was possible, and then English was studied, followed by people, by the educated sections of the people everywhere in India. If they spoke in Malayalam, for example, or in Tamil, or in Hindi, or in Bengali, then only those regions, people in those regions could follow. On the other hand, even today, English is the common language for academic communication for all purposes. So, if you have an All India conference, we cannot have it in Hindi or in Tamil or in any other language except in English. That is why 60 years after the independence, we still cling on to English as the common medium of education and communication. Now, as I told you, history was not there. With the introduction of the British rule, first and at the first stage by the East India Company, the areas which they conquered, they introduced English education. They called it modern education. It was modern in that sense, and then they started teaching the way they used to teach in England. So, British history was part of their curriculum, and here they introduced both British history and Indian history. When we were young, in my generation, we still inherited that pattern, so that the papers in history which we had to learn and get examined about were British history and Indian history, general. There was no separation between the study of Indian history and South Indian history, or regional history was never part of it. Just one paper on Indian history in general, and the other thing was the British history. In one sense, this was useful to us, because in British history there were good books, and those books taught about their evolution, their general development and their development as a parliamentary system, their rights and their views, freedom of speech and things like that, from Magna Carta onwards, that they taught us in order to inculcate in us an admiration for their system. One thing we in India derived from that was, of course, an admiration to some extent, but along with that also a kind of disappointment that there was no such thing in the teaching of Indian history. Indian history was generally taught as the history of a series of invasions, foreign invasions. Why this was so? No questions were asked, and Indian history was mainly the story of the conquest of some parts of India or whole of India by a foreign power. Maybe they were classified as Muslim or Mughal, British, like that. Anyway, conquest of India from Alexander's time onwards,
invasions
and conquest. So, history of India was the history of invasions and conquest. There was some resistance sometimes, but that was a minor thing. The main thing was that India was a land to be conquered by others. So, in that system of education studies and the books written about that, no questions were asked as to why India became a land to be conquered by other countries, other leaders from outside, whether there was any resistance movement, whether the same thing. See, for example, when European history, of course, sometimes part of European history was also taught to us. European history, in Europe you don't have such things. You have things like feudalism, feudal society, and then industrial development. Before that, Renaissance, Reformation of religion, and then industrialization, enlightenment. Such things are there. Of course, conquest by one nation about another, that was there occasionally, but that was not the main thing. The main thing was the evolution of European society from its ancient Greek and Roman moorings to the modern type of thing. But in India, in the case of Indian history, no such evolution was planned, no such idea was there in the books written, because the early books on Indian history written by East India Company people, like James Mill, for example, Elphinstone and things like that. Their idea was to write a history of the country that they conquered and administered.
And then the reaction to these imperialist writings later.
See, but since we were taught or we were given the instruction about British history and Indian history, the new generations in India began to ask questions. Why is it that India was always conquered? Whether there was any attempt to throw out the domination of those people. Such questions were asked, and then when they taught us about British nationalism and British parliamentary system, it was an unwritten constitution with an evolution of rights like Magna Carta, and then the reform acts from 1832 onwards, parliamentary reform and social reform and all that. Then naturally such questions were being planted in the minds of the younger generation of Indians also. So, from about the close of the 19th century, we find that Indians asked these questions. For example, in 1857, in the middle of the 19th century, there was what those British writers called the Sepoy Mutiny, the rebellion of a section of Indian soldiers called Sepoys against the authority of the East India Company. But that was represented as Sepoy Mutiny, a mutiny by the Indian soldiers of the British East India Company. Later on, when our people started thinking and writing about it, earlier what A.L. Basham, for example, and other writers on historiography in India, they have called it that Indian reader, it was not meant for Indian readers. Firstly, Indian history was meant for British administrators who were coming to India. They had to learn something about India, about their own administration.
It was taught in the Haileybury College as well. That James Mill's
James Mill, and then Other writers were there, Elphinstone, Vincent Smith. He was himself a member of the Indian Civil Service. After retirement, he wrote a book on ancient India. So, in such things, kings, rulers, statesmen, and then foreign conquerors. So, Alexander, for example, there was a chapter on Alexander's conquest of India. Alexander never conquered India. He came only up to the gates of India,
up to Punjab.
Up to Punjab, and then returned. There was no conquest of India, but about 80 pages were reserved in a book of 300 or 400 pages for the conquest of India by Alexander. It was not there, it was a non-existent thing. Likewise, there was another chapter on the Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey, but there was no battle. It is only planned and never occurred. But the Battle of Plassey and the consequences of the Battle of Plassey, followed by the Battle of Buxar and things like that, that was there. This was the way in which it was written, without any consideration for the sentiments of the Indian subjects, for the benefit of the British administrators. That was the way it was conceived. Later on, when our national movement got strengthened after 1885, when the Indian National Congress was organized, gradually our own people, Indian scholars, started writing about Indian history. Even that was modeled on what they taught us. Some corrections were made. For example, you have Sarkar writing about medieval history, Mughal history, Jadunath Sarkar was there, and there were other Indian scholars who started writing. Mukherjee, R.C. Majumdar, R.K. Mukherjee, those people started writing, but the plan of chapters and the organization of themes was modeled on what the British had given us. There was not much of a change.
That tripartite division was there, ancient, medieval, modern.
That is very interesting, that division. It is good that you mentioned that. The first period was called the Hindu period. The next period was called the Muslim period. But the third period was not called the Christian period, but the British period. So, that kind of a very unscientific division was there. Why was the earlier period called the Hindu period? Because Hinduism, you see, even there I have an observation to make. There is no religion called Hinduism. Like Islam or Christianity, there is no scripture, there is no Hindu religious organization as a whole, and nothing which will make a person Hindu. So, I am born into a Hindu society. I never observed any of the rituals and regulations. I never studied any of the holy books or sacred books, but I am still a Hindu. There is no way of excommunicating me. But in other Semitic religions like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, there is a way of proselytizing and converting people to that religion and sending people out of that religion. These two are absent, and Hindus don't. It's a way of life, it's a traditional thing. They don't have a method of insisting on the kind of prayer, the holy book.
And even that term is used later only.
Later. Hinduism, I used to write and speak in the sense that Hindu religion is a creation of the British rule. When they started taking census, they classified some people as Muslims, others as Christians, others as Parsis, others as Buddhists, and then the rest of them, the rest of the population, including the civilian population in the cities and villages of India and the Adivasi or tribal population, everybody was a Hindu. That was the general method. So, they created Hinduism as a religion. Otherwise, the term Hindu meant had only a geographical dimension. It was the connotation was based on territory. people outside the subcontinent, people in West Asia for example, they called the people who lived in this area Hindu, in the sense that they were people who lived on the other side of the Indus river or the Sindhu river. So, Sindhu or Hindu or Hindu are the same, only the letters differ, because Europeans pronounce it as Hindu and our people pronounced it as Hindu, and others, some others in outside India pronounce it as Sindhu. It is all the same. It is a geographical denomination, but Britishers, when they had to take a census, called it a religion separate from Islam and Christianity and Parsi and Buddhist religions. So, this was the way in which the East India Company and later on the universities in British India under the British government organized the writing and teaching of history in India.
How this writing, early colonial writing, then later the reaction from the nationalists, then later the Indian, after independence actually Indians began to think about it and rewrite the history.
Even before independence, you know, R.C. Majumdar for example, R.K. Mukherjee, and these people started writing Indian history in a different way, in an Indian fashion, even before independence. The independence came slightly after that, but the concept of an India which was created by the British was taken up, and the history of India was written by Indian scholars also. So, that was a kind of opposition between the British concept of Indian history, British and foreign European in general, and the Indian concept of Indian history. These were divergent and mostly opposite to each other. Then in the by the middle of the 20th century, another big change occurred. That was partly due to the influence of Marx and Marxism, partly due to questioning of the narrative system, that is more of social problems were to be taken up, the rural background, agriculture, development of industries, growth of Indian languages, these things were getting included more and more. But even then the system of historical teaching and the way of Indian historical consciousness was different in different regions of India. In Bengal for example, where the East India Company had first established their authority, it was in one way. They were ahead of other regions of India, and after the shifting of the capital of British India from Calcutta to Delhi in 1911, after that there was a big change, because Bengal was no longer going ahead of other provinces, but provincialism prevailed in general. Differences were there between one province and another, and generally the medium of education was English. So, that gave us some kind of a uniformity. The content of education changed. I think mainly the reason for that was one thing, the writing of not a historian. See, in many cases it is not the professional historian who makes a big change in history. The what is that shift, the paradigm shifts in history are made not by professional historians who follow the earlier their predecessors, but by other people. See,
those who came from other
disciplines and out of curiosity or necessity made a study of Indian history. In India's case, in my generation, it was the publication of a book called An Introduction to the Study of Indian History
by D.D. Kosambi.
By D.D. Kosambi. He was a scholar in Sanskrit. He knew English very well. He was educated in America because his father was there, the senior Kosambi was a Buddhist scholar, and he was invited to the American universities in the Department of Buddhist Studies. So, this younger Kosambi grew up in the States and imbibed the lessons of democracy and enlightenment from the American atmosphere. At the same time, he was a good student of Marx and Marxism also. He called himself a Marxist, but as a Marxist, he was different from the so-called Marxists in India. Dogmatic, doctrinal, and he had a great contempt also for them. He called them official Marxists, and in his book, in this book also, Introduction to the Study of Indian History, which was published in 1946. I passed SSLC in 1947. This book was published just 1 year before that. It was new at that time, and when I joined the college and started learning subjects like history, this was a fascinating thing, because it raised several questions which were never asked in Indian historical studies earlier. So, D.D. Kosambi, who was a mathematician and a statistician by profession, but was also a Sanskrit scholar and a scholar in history in a way differently, and an archaeologist, an armchair kind of archaeologist at first, then a field archaeologist. Numismatics was also part of his study. So, it was a new kind of concept of history that he introduced there, and these questions led to a big paradigm shift in history. During that period, in my youth, for example, the Indian History Congress had been organized, and while I joined the Kerala University and later on the Calicut University, during that period, we had the feeling that our universities in South India were very much isolated from the mainstream of Indian culture. So, many of my contemporaries had some protest about Indian historical studies and historians, because they thought that Indian history was conceived even by nationalists as the history of North India. So, why not South India? When we had such debates and discussions, I used to ask these people, well, if they neglect South Indian history, it may be for different reasons, but one important reason is that South Indian historians are not coming forward to write South Indian history.
It's almost invisible.
Invisible. They were not, their presence was not there. There was a reason for that, because one thing, the big empires in our history were all in the Indo-Gangetic plains. They had either Pataliputra or Ujjaini or some other place, later on Delhi, as the capital of their empire. And after the Mauryan Empire, which extended southwards up to Mysore, all Indian empires were confined to North India.
Harshan and
Guptas and Harsha and all that. That was a real reason, real cause for that. But combined with that, as a result of that, most of the Indian histories, nationalist histories also, were histories of North India. So, some of us asked questions about that, why not? There were real obstacles in the way. For one thing, in the Indo-Gangetic plains, generally Hindustani was a common language. It could be followed from one part, from the Himalayan region to the Vindhya regions, in between, what was called Aryavarta. But in the south, there were different languages, the Dravidian languages, Telugu in Andhra, Kannada in south of that, and then Tamil Nadu and Kerala. At least 4 important languages were there, and these regions had different forms of history also. So, that was a real difficulty, but we had to overcome that. Then there was the Indian History Congress, and when I joined as a lecturer in the Department of Kerala History first, and then Calicut University. Another thing is, which I remember now that Kerala University, strangely enough, did not have a department for history. In those days, in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, Kerala University had many other subjects, economics, then sociology, anthropology, everything was there except history, except history. For some strange reason, history was not taken up at the university level. What they did was to teach history as it was taught in other areas, that is all, that is in the colleges.
And you also studied PG at Madras University.
Madras University, but there was the same thing, it was the same thing. There was no attempt to raise questions about this, and it was as late as 1970 that we had a department of history in the Kerala University. I started my research long before that, in 1960, because at that time the University Grants Commission started distributing fellowships and scholarships to teachers of history. And since I had a first class and first rank from the Madras University in history, I had applied and I got the fellowship granted, but I could not take it up because from the days of my student days, I got somehow interested in Kerala. One thing is, I loved the language Malayalam. I had some literary interests, literary friends, storytellers, novelists, poets, etc. Somehow or other, a love of Kerala had developed in my mind. But in my historical studies, I never came up against any reference about Kerala. There were only 2 points where Kerala was mentioned in the writings and teachings of Indian history. One was that Shankaracharya was born in Karadi in Kerala, that is all. But while it was stated that he was born in Kerala, it was a fact that he was never in Kerala. He wandered about the whole of India. He got his Jnanpith somewhere in Kanchi, and afterwards he had different mathas in different parts of India, but there were some mathas in Thrissur also. That's all. One point that he was born in Kerala. Another point of reference to Kerala was that Vasco da Gama landed in Calicut. In his search for India, they had sent him and he landed in Kerala. These were only, see, one thing, Shankaracharya was born in Kerala, but he was not brought up and he was not recognized as an author in Kerala. For that he had to go outside Kerala. Second thing, Vasco da Gama's coming was not a blessing for India, but it was the beginning of European contact and later on European colonization also. These were the only 2 occasions where Kerala was mentioned. So, with my love of the Malayalam language and Kerala region, I had a desire to do some work, some research on the history of Kerala. But I found that it was not possible. For one thing, there was no history department there. Secondly, there were no books also. The only thing which was known about Kerala in those days, in the 50s and 60s, when I started my work, the only thing known was that there was a legendary Kerala Perumal, Chairman Perumal. Whether he was one individual or a dynasty or a kingdom or an empire, nothing was known. That it was a misty thing. Mysterious Chairman Perumal was there. And everybody who referred to Kerala's past, they used to mention it as something which is not known, which is vague and all that. But still I wanted to do some work, if possible, with this grant from the University Grants Commission. I wanted to work on the history, ancient history of Kerala, but there was no department as such. Luckily for me, I had some contact with the University Grants Commission people. It was Dr. Satish Chandra, Professor Satish Chandra, who was the chairman of the UGC at that time. He was a historian himself, and through my studies I had come into contact with him. I wrote to him and told him that I have a fellowship from the UGC. I wanted to do work on the ancient history of Kerala, but there is no department of history. He couldn't help me because the Kerala University must be prepared to. But he gave me a concession, said, you can work, if you are confident that you can work, you can work on history of Kerala in Kerala University without a department. You consult anybody. So I took it up in 1960. Then there was no department, but there were some people who were writing about it. But I consulted them and read their books and all that. I was not satisfied. But one professor, he was a professor of Oriental languages, Elankulam Kunjan Pillai. He was teaching Sanskrit and Malayalam in Calicut and Kerala University. He had written some books about Kerala history on his own. That was also introduced by a strange combination of circumstances, because Kerala University was a byproduct of the Madras University, and in those days whatever the Madras University people used to do, they used to copy. In Madras University, somewhere in the 60s, I think, in the 50s, they brought a resolution saying that those who take up the study of Tamil history of Tamil Nadu, must do a paper on the history of Tamil Nadu. MA people, those who take up the study of MA Tamil in postgraduate studies in Tamil literature must do a paper on Tamil history. So our Kerala University copied that. They introduced the same kind of regulation, saying that whoever studies Malayalam language
must study Kerala history.
Must have a paper on Kerala history. Then Kunjan Pillai himself has written about it, and he told me at that time, he was a teacher of Sanskrit and Malayalam in the Kerala University. When this new regulation came, there was nobody to teach. So as the youngest member of that department, it was imposed on him. He searched for books, and he found that of course there were some books on the later period in the history of Kerala, when the Portuguese were there and the Dutch were there, and then the British Company. These were by Sardar K.M. Panikkar. He had a very good book on Indian history in general. You must have seen that, a survey of Indian history, very good book. In one sense, I would consider it even more significant than Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery of India. Pandit Nehru writes about history in a very interesting manner, but I thought that Panikkar's survey of Indian history had deeper insights about the way in which Indian society developed. Anyway, he had two books on Kerala. One is Malabar and the Portuguese. The other was Malabar and the Dutch. And later on he added another, Malabar and the British. So the whole thing called History of Kerala, including the so-called Portuguese period, the Dutch period and the British period, was brought under one cover and called Kerala history. That was available. But what about the earlier period? Professor Elankulam, who was a language teacher, he did not find anything, but with his knowledge of Sanskrit and Tamil and the grammar of Tamil, he could see that there were several inscriptions published by the Department of Archaeology in Travancore, in the Travancore Archaeological Series. So he started burying himself into this and came up with certain ideas. He selected out of the hundreds of inscriptions which Gopinath Rao T.A. Gopinath Rao and K.V. Subramanya Iyer and later on A.S. Ramanath Iyer had published in the Travancore archaeological series. He picked up those which were about the Chera kings and he brought them together. It was very difficult because for certain strange reasons the inscriptions in Kerala were different from the inscriptions in Tamil Nadu or in Andhra, because there most of the inscriptions were royal orders and they will start with an introductory portion.
May Kirti.
May Kirti in Tamil, Prasasti in Sanskrit. That will give an idea of themselves, their ancestors, their achievements, genealogy, etc., etc. So, this May Kirti or Prasasti portion was useful in fixing the period of the rulers and then
genealogy
and activities, conquests, reforms, etc. That was absent in Kerala's inscriptions. That was a very strange thing. It was completely absent. There is no inscription. Of course, it was only much later that we realized that Kerala inscriptions are not royal orders at all. Even I, after so many years of study, this didn't occur to me. It was much later, because the regnal years of kings were mentioned. So, the 5th year of King Sthana Ravi or the 24th year of King Bhaskara Ravi, such was mentioned. But beyond that, whose son he was, whom he succeeded, all these things were absent. And events of their rule were also not mentioned, except the grants which they made, or sometimes or others made to certain temples. Actually, the inscriptions, historical inscriptions in Kerala are not inscriptions of the royal administrators, but they are only resolutions passed by the village assemblies or the temple committees. That, of course, they were not studied as such, they were taken in general to be
just for dating. They are mentioning
just for dating. They are using the name of the ruler concerned. So, these differences were there. That is why the study of Kerala inscriptions and Kerala history through them became very, very difficult. But somehow or other, this Professor Elankulam Kunjan Pillai, the Sanskrit teacher, he labored very hard and organized a chronology and a political history. So, there was something there to teach, apart from the modern history done by Sardar K.M. Panikkar and the other not very useful usual type of pamphlets. The real thing was produced by Professor Elankulam Kunjan Pillai, who was not a professional historian, but he was compelled to teach Kerala history. So, he created Kerala history. He was a pioneer in that sense. When I came into the field, people of my generation, we found that it was possible to take him as a model, but he was not generally acknowledged as that. His writings were mostly in Malayalam, so it was not known outside Kerala.
Except that translation studies in Kerala.
That came much later.
Yeah.
He requested some people to translate, and P.K. Sharat Kumar translated many. That came much later,
70s.
In the 70s. After his publication of Kerala Charithrathinte Iradaña Kerala Charithra Prashnangal, first part and second part, and then Keralam 9-10 നൂറ്റാണ്ടുകളിൽ, all these were published, and later on this English thing, that is studies in Kerala. History of Kerala, that was published. So, there was something there. When my generation took over, we found this. But when because of the kindness of Professor Satish Chandra, chairman of UGC, I could take it up, but there was no history professor. There was one retired history professor, V. Narayanan Pillai. He was also a member of syndicate of Kerala University. So, my friends told me to meet him. I went and met him. He was a good gentleman from Trivandrum, and he told me, Mr. Narayanan, you may not get any help from me as far as your research is concerned, because though I was a professor of history and principal university college, I never did any research. Whatever research familiarity I have, it is from my friend Elankulam Kunjan Pillai. He is a language scholar. You go and approach him. I will sign your papers for receiving the fellowship, but with regard to academic help, it is better that you go to people like that. So, one person, he recognized Elankulam's work. Another person was N.V. Krishna Warrior, who was the editor of the Mathrubhumi weekly. Another person was A. Sridhara Menon, who was a history professor in St. Thomas College, and he was appointed later by Professor Mundasheri as the editor of the Kerala Gazetteer. He had the good sense to perceive that of all the writings on Kerala's ancient past, it was the writing of Elankulam Kunjan Pillai that was most reliable, and he absorbed them, he digested them, he used them. He did not do any original research in ancient Kerala history, but he was responsible for popularizing. And in his books were textbooks in our Kerala colleges.
Still, Survey of Kerala History is the book which
is the basic textbook that everybody uses. But that is another story. He was a very independent writer. He did not follow the dictates of political parties. There was one occasion I remember very well, that is, he was awarded a Padma Bhushan or something like that, Padma Shri or Padma Bhushan, I don't remember. Padma Bhushan, I think. In that particular year, there were 8 persons who received Padma Bhushan from Kerala, and the Kerala government at that time invited all the 7 people except him, this historian who was awarded Padma Bhushan. The reason was this, that in the 50th year of Indian independence, the central government had a scheme of publishing the history of freedom struggle in the different states, and they asked the government. Here, fortunately or unfortunately, it was the Marxist party that was in power. Narayanan was the chief minister. They refused. They said, well, why should we produce a history of the freedom struggle in Kerala? That is mostly the struggle conducted by the Congress party. So we are not publishing it. That was their idea. They didn't say that, but they refused to publish. But then, towards the end of that year, when only 3 months remained, there was another order and probably some threat from the central government. They suddenly decided to publish a history of the freedom struggle in Kerala. Who will write it in 3 months' time? They were wondering. Nobody would. But Sridhara Menon had the advantage that as a gazetteer editor, he had edited the gazetteers of different districts. And in every gazetteer, district gazetteer, the freedom struggle formed one chapter. He could easily do that, and he was a very quick writer. So, somebody persuaded this state government to approach him. Normally, he is not amenable to such things, but since some of his classmates and friends asked him, he agreed, and he prepared a history of freedom struggle in Kerala within 3 months. Then at the time, on the particular date, he was ready to post the manuscript to Trivandrum, but he received an order from the government of Kerala saying that his book has to be submitted to a committee of 3. They will be E.M.S. Namboodiripad, P. Govindapillai and K.N. Ganeshan. Ganeshan wisely withdrew. He said, I am not competent to judge the work of Sridhara Menon. PG was silent. No, PG also said, I am not a professional historian. But EMS did not protest or withdraw. But Sridhara Menon, on his receipt of this letter, said, my books are my books. I don't want any committee to go through it, edit and censor and agree to the publication. So, I am not sending it to you. Then he sent it to his own private publishers, some Vishwanathan or something, and it's a very good book, very short thing, 150 pages or so, but a very good book, both in Malayalam and English. It was published by him. This is the way in which he got the hostility of the Communist Party in Kerala.
Yeah.
So, when he was awarded Padma Bhushan, he was not treated well by the government. In spite of the fact, it is surprising, you know, that shows the mentality of servitude. See, I would not blame others except the history teachers themselves, you know. Our teachers are such that they are afraid of the ruling parties. And in Kerala, in all the colleges, Indian history and history of Kerala were taught mostly on the basis of his textbooks, Sridharaman's textbooks. But even then, when Sridharaman was awarded a Padma Bhushan, none of the college teachers were ready to give a reception to him or to congratulate him. Some of us, about a handful of us, went to Trivandrum and tried to organize a reception for him. At first he said, no, I don't need it, but when we insisted, he agreed. But none of the history teachers from Kerala colleges, from Trivandrum or elsewhere, participated in that. Only others outsiders participated. This is the way in which, you know, history has developed through some daring, courageous, independent writers against the control of the ruling parties. In my opinion, the writing and teaching of history also has been vitiated in Kerala by an overdose of party politics.
We will conclude this on observing on the South Indian history, how it is written, South Indian history, as the time we have.
Yeah. In Madras University, Madras was the first of these universities to take up the teaching of history, and in a grand fashion also. There were very good historians like K.A. Neelakanta Shastri and T.V. Mahalingam in the Madras University, in the history department of the Madras University, and due to their writings, Neelakanta Shastri's the Cholas, the Pandyan kingdom, and also the history of South India, published in 1956. These books had become so popular that the old complaint about the absence of South Indian history in general Indian history could now be overcome, because the facts there could be incorporated into general histories of India also. Anyway, that was the way in which the history of South India developed as a separate sub-discipline of Indian history. Neelakanta Shastri was my teacher. That is, by the time I joined, he had retired, but then he acted as what is a professor emeritus, and he gave us special lectures in Indian history. I was one of his pet students also. So it was he who created the sub-discipline of South Indian history. But strangely enough, even in his history of South India, Kerala was absent. Not out of his fault, because there was nothing like that. The only writings, serious writings, which could be taken up by a historian, were the writings of Vilankulam Kunjan Pillai, and they were all in Malayalam at that time. Yeah. So he didn't know anything about it, about the inscriptions and the archaeological studies of Kerala past. Because the modern period was known, because as I told you, Sardar Panikkar had written, and many others, Narayanan had taken it up and all that. But the earlier portions were not available, and then I thought I will follow the model of Shastriji. His English is very good. At one time, the Oxford University Press approached me to update his history of South India. It was not done, that was for other reasons at a later stage. But I told them, you cannot change any sentence in Shastri's book of South Indian history, because his English is so good, so perfect, so clean, without exaggeration, without understatement, with proper references, elegant English language is there. I won't do anything like that, but I will update it by adding some passages which could not be written in his period in 1956, and adding some new footnotes which were not available to him. Such things I will do, I said. That is the way in which Neelanda Shastri provided the model. Of course, T.V. Mahalingam also took up the publication of several inscriptions from South India, and then history of Karnataka, Salatore had written, and the history of Andhra was written by other people. History of the Pallavas was written by Meenakshi, Dr. Meenakshi. So, history of South India that way was mostly the contribution of the history department of Madras University and Mysore University and other universities. History of Kerala had to be done first, and Elankulam had done it. Then with the blessings of the UGC, I took it up, and my book on my PhD thesis on Perumals of Kerala was, it has been published only recently, though it was awarded the degree some 40 years ago. That was a continuation and completion of Elankulam's work. Of course, I differed from him in many ways, because pioneers commit great mistakes also. One very big mistake that Elankulam had committed was that he thought there was 100 years war. He did not understand that the land of Kerala, the kingdom of Kerala, he called it the Chera Empire. The kingdom of Kerala was ruled by Perumals with the help of Brahmins. That he did not realize. There were many such shortcomings. Not only that, in the with the concept of the 100 years war, he attributed the rise of the feudal system, the rise of the Devadasi system, the rise of the Chaver suicide squads, all these things, and rise of Marumakatayam also, to the so called 100 years war. That of course we had to reject, and now I think we have reached a platform there. So, we have in the general context of the new Indian history, reliable books on South Indian history as such, and some books, some reliable works on the Chera kingdom, on the pre-Chera Sangam age, and the post-Chera principalities we have somewhere. So, we have a reasonable collection of books on this regional history also.
Thank you, sir, for coming over here to share your views on Indian history, and thanks.